The story of the Sodder family on Christmas Eve 1945 is one of the most haunting mysteries in American history. A fire broke out in the dead of night at the home of George and Jenny Sodder in Fayetteville, West Virginia, not only destroying everything in an instant, but also carrying their 5 children into an unsolved darkness. While you might think the children were burned to death in the fire, the truth is full of twists and turns. No bodies were ever found in the ashes, a near impossible feat, since human bones are notoriously difficult to completely destroy, even at high temperatures. The Sodders searched in vain for answers for decades, leaving behind not only a missing person, but also one of the most thrilling tales of intrigue, strangeness, and undying hope. So what really happened to the 5 Sodder children? We are left with unanswered questions and an unending mystery. She tried to calm herself down, went back to bed, and pulled the covers up, but the uneasiness couldn't be dispelled. The strange sounds kept echoing in her head, making Jenny feel uncomfortable. She looked at the clock on the bedside table. 12:30 a.m. Time seemed to pass too slowly. Each second and minute dragged on heavily. This vague feeling of anxiety still haunted her. She pulled the covers over herself, trying to fall back asleep, but every little sound, from the branches hitting the window to the wind whistling through the cracks, woke her up. Everything became strange and unusual in the dark night. Jenny felt like something was watching her, but couldn't figure out what it was. Suddenly, a loud noise came from above. This time, a loud bang. Jenny couldn't sit still. She quickly stood up, her heart pounding in her chest. She called out her children's names. "John! Marion! Where are you?" But no one answered. An eerie silence fell over the house. She couldn't hear the children's footsteps or George's snores. Everything seemed to have stopped. Jenny ran up the stairs, her hands shaking. She called out her children's names, her footsteps echoing in the darkness. When she got to the children's room, she noticed that the door was closed, showing no signs of anything unusual. She gently opened the door and looked inside, but there was no one. There was no John, Marion, George Jr., or any of the children in the room. She continued to search the other rooms, but they were all empty. Jenny's heart stopped, a terrible fear rising in her. She went back to the living room where Marion had been sleeping earlier, but even Marion was gone. Her heart clenched. She rushed outside, and the light from the car headlights shone through the window, reflecting off the curtains. Her footsteps echoed on the cold floor. She felt like something was lurking in the darkness, making it hard for her to breathe. "Where are my children?" Jenny asked herself in confusion. She stepped out into the yard, the cold wind whipping her hair. There was no trace in the darkness, but there was a strange feeling lingering around her, as if something invisible was watching her. The fear had become an obsession, and Jenny could not calm down. She knew she had to find out what was going on, but the night was too dark, and the house, every corner of it, now seemed like a terrifying trap. Marion stood frozen in front of the phone, her hands shaking as she gripped the receiver, her heart filled with despair. The operator's words rang in her ears, cold and unsympathetic. "Sorry, the call you made was not connected." She tried again, but nothing changed. Her eyes were blurred with tears, and inside her, her fear became an unquenchable wave. "It can't be," she whispered, her heart filled with doubt. "Help must come. How can this be?" She turned back to look at the burning house in the distance, where the fire seemed to be consuming everything. At this point, George and Jenny also had no strength to move. George, in his madness, tried to call the fire department again, but their phones still didn't work. Everything seemed to be against them. The cold of the winter night cut into their flesh, but the pain in their hearts was the coldest thing. "Don't worry, we'll make it," Jenny said desperately, trying to comfort the children who were still standing outside, shivering with cold and fear. But inside her, a feeling of unease grew. What could they do when they couldn't save their children trapped in the fire? How could they endure when the whole world seemed to have turned its back on them? Marion turned back to him once more, then realized something. "I can't wait any longer," she whispered, determined to do something, whatever it was. "I have to do something." She walked back into the house, tears in her eyes, hurrying through the cold darkness, unsure of how it would all end. There was only fear and fragile hope, and the one question she couldn't stop thinking about: could their children be saved? He did not have time to pay attention to the cold of winter. His only goal was to notify the Fayetteville fire chief. Inside the burning house, the Sodders did not realize the extent of the fire until a neighbor returned with the devastating news. While they were still trying to figure out what was happening, the fire quickly spread, engulfing the entire structure. However, help did not arrive quickly enough to help. When the neighbor came to find Fayetteville Fire Chief F.J. Morris, he was fast asleep, completely unaware of the tragedy unfolding not far away. When he was awakened and made aware of the situation, Morris immediately began to activate the alarm system through a telephone tree model. This was a slow method, relying on calling each individual in the chain of contacts. As each call was made, precious minutes passed, leaving George Sodder and his family to struggle in panic without timely help. In the chaos, each moment seemed to stretch forever, but the delay in emergency response left an irreparable void. This not only added to the heartbreak of the story, but also highlighted the fatal weaknesses of the emergency systems of the time, a painful but necessary lesson for future improvement. Although the Sodders' house was only 2.5 miles from the fire station, the slow response meant it took firefighters 7 hours to arrive. By that time, the fire had consumed everything, and by the time the fire trucks arrived, all that remained was a pile of ash. The scene was a nightmare for George. The feeling of utter helplessness, the anger at the poor response of the firefighters, and the deep grief of having to cope with the loss of his 5 beloved children. When dawn broke on Christmas morning in 1945, the Sodder house was nothing but smoldering ash. The laughter of children that had once echoed through the walls had been silenced. The children that George and Jenny had hoped would be found safe had been lost in the flames, leaving an unfillable void in the family's hearts. Despite their desperate efforts, the firefighters found no sign of life. No bodies, no bones, only an eerie silence and the lingering smell of smoke. Something inexplicable seemed to hang over the incident: the complete disappearance of the children, leaving no trace, left everyone in shock. During the 7 terrifying hours, George Sodder had faced an indescribable range of emotions, from fragile hope to panic to utter grief. It was not just the material loss. He had lost a part of his soul, the children he loved most. Standing in the ruins, George was frozen in a feeling of helplessness, a cold, suffocating emptiness. As the last fire engines drove away, leaving behind a scorched black earth and a heavy winter sky, George stood there, looking toward the house that had once been his home. His tears did not flow, they were consumed by the flames in anger and deep pain. That loss, on that fateful Christmas day, became a wound that would never heal in the hearts of the entire Sodder family. After the fire, as soon as the dust settled, officials quickly closed the case, as an unavoidable accident. On December 26, just one day after a tearful Christmas, the police coroner's jury declared the fire the result of an electrical short circuit. On December 30, death certificates were issued for the 5 Sodder children, ending any lingering hope. To outsiders, everything seemed settled. But to George, things were different. The decisions had been made too quickly, too hastily. George felt something was wrong, a deep unease that he could not put into words. Why had officials come to this conclusion in just a few days, without any in-depth investigation? Why had no bodies or traces of his children been found in the ashes? These questions loomed in his mind, not giving him a moment's peace. Despite the pain in his heart, George tried to find a way to face reality. He brought soil from elsewhere, leveling the ruins of the family home. There, he planted a small garden, each flower bush like a silent prayer sent to the lost children. Every morning, when the sunlight shone on the garden, George stood still and watched, as if searching for the silhouettes of his children among the blooming petals. His wife, Jenny, also struggled in the painful silence. She picked up each remaining piece of coal in the ashes, looking for a small sign of her children. During sleepless nights, she knitted each sweater, sometimes stopping because of the tears that kept falling. The family tried to rebuild their lives, but the emptiness was still there, like a haunting ghost that never disappeared. With each passing day, they felt more deeply the loss, not just of their home, but of the laughter, dreams, and boundless love they had for their 5 children. The tragedy not only took away their loved ones, but also left an unanswered question, a wound that would never heal in the hearts of George and Jenny. George still couldn't accept what had happened, and although nothing could change the truth, he decided to try to move on. He brought dirt from elsewhere and filled in the ruins of the old house, then planted a small garden in memory of his lost children. The family tried to rebuild their lives after the tragedy, although they were always tormented by the irreplaceable loss. If the story ended there, perhaps the Sodder family would be forever in pain from the loss. But a strange event in the spring changed everything. While George was supervising the construction of a new house nearby, a worker, a telephone repairman, approached and reported something strange he had just discovered. The worker had climbed a telephone pole near the property to check the telephone wires. As was his job, he expected to find a burned or damaged telephone wire after the fire, but what he found shocked him. Instead of seeing a burned or dangling telephone wire as a sign of destruction, the worker discovered that the telephone wire had been neatly severed, clearly an intentional act. Not simply severed, but the wire had been cut cleanly, as if someone had used a tool to do it on purpose. This immediately raised a big question in George's mind. He realized that the telephone wires could not have burned in the fire if they weren't there in the first place. And if they weren't burnt, someone must have cut them before the fire started. A sense of dread began to rise in George, because cutting the telephone line could mean that someone had intentionally prevented help or an emergency from coming. He remembered the rush of the failed calls, the delays of the fire department. Was what had happened to his family part of a larger plan? An unimaginable evil? And could his children really be alive, as part of some conspiracy? George stood still, a chill running down his spine. His children could have been kidnapped that very night, and everyone from the fire department to the investigating agencies had been blinded by the false narrative. And now, before him, was a detail that could not be ignored. The telephone pole had been deliberately severed. The big question was the fire just a random event? Or was it part of a larger conspiracy that the Sodder family had to face. Jenny's thoughts circled the night of the fire, keeping her awake, unable to free herself from the questions that no one could answer. She had lost 5 children, and the pain was breaking her, but not just because of the loss, but because of the mismatches in the story people told her about the fire. Why had there been no cries for help, no trace of loved ones in the house that had been completely destroyed? Why had there been no bones? Why was there no smell of burning flesh in the air? Jenny couldn't understand it, and the more she thought about it, the more unease she felt. Something was wrong, something was being hidden. Details that seemed insignificant made her more anxious than ever. She'd heard of another fire in a nearby community, a deadly one with 7 victims, and when the investigation was completed, 7 skeletons had been found. But why hadn't there been any bones in her family's fire? That only made her more confused. Jenny couldn't let those questions haunt her any longer. She decided to find out. Even though what she was about to do wasn't an official science experiment, she felt the need to try. She took the animal bones she'd used in her family's meals, chicken bones, pork ribs from the trash, and put them in her oven. She turned the oven up to the highest setting possible, hoping that if bones could burn in a fire, she'd see something similar to what happened in a fire. But no matter how high she turned the temperature, the bones didn't turn to ash. They were just burned, but they still retained their original shape, not completely gone. Even though she knew her oven couldn't reach the temperatures of a large fire, in her condition, that wasn't enough to convince her that what had happened in her house was reasonable. Jenny couldn't stop thinking about the truth, or lack thereof. She began to realize that maybe this wasn't a simple fire. These strange, inexplicable things weren't coincidences. Something bigger was going on. Jenny's sense of confusion and anxiety continued to mount. Finally, she approached a worker at a local crematorium who surprisingly confirmed what Jenny had always suspected. After experiencing the heat of a large fire, human bones could still be found, which meant that the impossibility of her house fire no bones, no trace of her children was an anomaly. An inexplicable thing. Jenny's mind was reeling in a tidal wave of doubt. She couldn't believe what she was seeing and hearing. What really happened that night? And who was behind all of this? George's obsession went beyond grief. It became an informal but determined investigation. Every night, by the dim light of his desk lamp, he drew diagrams, listed clues, and tried to connect the dots into a complete picture. The insurance salesman's words rang out like a haunting curse. Your house will burn down, and your children will disappear. The threat was no longer a sudden outburst of anger. It carried a dark foreboding. Who would say such a thing without some plan or knowledge? Was it just a coincidence, George wondered, or a crucial piece of the puzzle that he had overlooked? The testimony of the neighbor and the bus driver only added to his obsession. Strange lights, falling objects, people throwing things onto the roof, all of them were isolated memories. But together, they revealed a terrifying conspiracy. George began asking around town, looking for answers that no one dared to provide. Perhaps, he thought, someone knew something but was afraid to speak out. Fayetteville was a small town, and the people behind the incident might be familiar. Jenny, meanwhile, was still searching for more tangible evidence. She wondered why no bodies or even bones of the children had been found in the ashes. She conducted a strange but determined experiment of her own. Jenny burned animal bones, chickens, pigs, cows, in the incinerator to test them. No matter how high the temperature, the bones remained. This convinced her that the fire from the house fire could not have completely burned human bones. If the children had not been in the fire, where had they gone? The Sodders continued to search, not only with hope, but also with anger and determination. They hung billboards along major roads with a clear message. Help us find our 5 missing children. The faces of Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty were boldly etched, their innocent eyes pleading for justice from strangers. The question became a mission. If someone had taken the children, were they still alive? And if so, where were they? As the days passed, answers did not come, but the Sodders' belief that the truth would come out remained steadfast. The loss had destroyed their home, but not their will. A woman at a motel in Charleston, about 50 miles from Fayetteville, reported seeing 5 children, 4 boys and a girl, along with 2 men and 2 women she did not recognize check in the night of the fire. She said they spoke Italian, appeared hurriedly, and avoided eye contact. The children did not say a word, as if they were being silenced or intimidated. One of the women in the group appeared extremely nervous, constantly looking back toward the window as if afraid someone would come. When asked why she did not report the disappearance at the time, she said she did not learn of the disappearance until several days later. In another town, a gas station attendant recalled seeing a car with out-of-state plates, with children matching the Sodders' description inside. The adults who were with them seemed particularly nervous when they saw him looking into the car. Another report came from Street. Louis Moe, a woman, claimed to have seen a picture of the children in the newspaper and was convinced she had seen them with a strange couple in a neighborhood across town. She went to talk to them, but the woman became hysterical and took the children away immediately. None of this was ever fully verified. No one was arrested. No one was charged. But to Jenny and George, it only confirmed what they were sure in their hearts. The fire was just smoke. The children had been kidnapped, and they might still be alive, somewhere. Then came the strange photograph, which arrived in the mail 20 years after the fire. Inside was a portrait of a young man in his 30s, with a handwritten note attached. Louis Sodder. I love my brother Frankie. Illil boys. Anany 1132 or 35. The family did not understand the message, but the face in the photo bore a striking resemblance to Louis, one of the missing children. The photo was sent from Kentucky. They hired an investigator to track the letter, but he disappeared without a trace after arriving. The question that has never been answered: if the children had indeed survived and grown up elsewhere, why did they never return? Threatened? Brainwashed? Or perhaps they never knew who they were? April 1946. Nearly 4 months after a strange fire destroyed the Sodder family home on Christmas Eve, a witness came forward. He said that the morning after the fire, they saw a young man rummaging through the ashes, taking something out, and then disappearing into the chaos. The details were initially vague. No one knew for sure whether the incident happened before or after the firefighters arrived. But one thing was certain: the crowd that had gathered at the time had given the man an opportunity to blend in and escape detection. The police quickly identified him, Lonnie Johnson, a known local thief. When they searched his home, they found a familiar item, a block and pulley, tools that George Sodder often used to repair cars. Under questioning, Lonnie denied any involvement in the fire, but when pressed, he made a chilling admission. He had been at the scene the night before the fire, and he had taken the ladder outside the Sodder house to cut the telephone lines. I was just going to steal it. I was afraid of getting caught, so I cut the lines so they wouldn't call the police before I could get away. That was his excuse. He insisted that he had taken nothing but the pulley block and had only returned after the house had burned to the ground to pick up the items. But it was strange, wasn't it? Why admit to something as suspicious as cutting the lines, but then completely deny any connection to the fire or the disappearance of the 5 children? Lonnie wasn't the first name on the list of shady characters. Before him was the strange driver who had approached George's children to ask for jobs. Then there's Nick, George's former business partner, with whom he had a bitter falling out shortly before the fire. By all accounts, Lonnie seems to be more than just a thief, but perhaps a cog in a larger conspiracy. Something meticulously planned to tear the Sodders apart forever. But as with all unsolved crimes, theories aren't enough. The Sodders need real evidence, something that can overturn the entire official police conclusion. And surprisingly, that's just around the corner. The testimony was shocking, but even more remarkable, he had not reported it until the following April. Why? Perhaps he thought it was a holiday prank, a Christmas fireworks display, or even a dangerous act that he did not want to be involved in. Whatever the motive for the silence, the testimony was enough to bring the Sodders back to the scene of the fire this time. Not to mourn, but to investigate. Shocking discovery in the backyard. While the family searched every nook and cranny, little Sylvia, the youngest daughter, ran around the yard like any curious child. Her little feet led her to a strange object lying in the grass, something like a metal ball, but with a helmet on one end. She picked it up with both hands, innocently, bewildered. George and his wife ran over, panicked. The father snatched the object, but it was the eldest son, John, who was home on leave at the time, who recognized it immediately. It's an incendiary grenade, a military-grade weapon. Silence fell. If true, it fit perfectly with George's description, a loud bang on the roof just before the fire broke out. Also in 1946, a few months after the terrible fire, a man walked into the police station carrying an old leather briefcase. The dim light in the police station made his face pale, as if haunted by terrible images. He walked over to the inspector's desk and sat down without saying a word. "What's the matter, sir?" the inspector asked, unable to hide his curiosity. The man raised his head, his eyes filled with confusion. He said, his voice trembling, "Can you imagine if one person said something that would change everything we thought about this fire? It would make us look at the whole thing in a completely different way." The inspector listened attentively, a feeling of unease rising in his heart. The man continued, "That fire was no accident. It was the result of a master plan that I, myself, was unwittingly drawn into." His words made the air in the room thick, each sentence heavy, as if secrets that had been hidden for months were suddenly revealed, just waiting to be exposed. He was a bus driver, and on Christmas Eve that year, the night the Sodders' house burned down, he was driving through the dark streets of Fayetteville. "I saw someone throw something like a fireball at the house," he said hoarsely, his eyes fixed on the inspector, as if trying to explain something he couldn't quite believe. "It was dark, but the light from the fire reflected off it, and I saw it clearly. I remember the red glow. It wasn't a normal fire." The inspector took note of his every word, but he couldn't help but doubt it. A fireball? What could it be? Was he seeing things? But the driver was clearly serious. He continued, "At first, I thought it was just an accidental fire, but then I saw a strange figure standing near the window right when the fire broke out. It was as if they were waiting for the right moment." His words silenced the room. The inspector paused for a moment, staring at the driver, as if weighing each word. "Can you describe the person in more detail?" the inspector asked, his voice hard. "I can't," the driver replied, bowing his head slightly. I only caught a glimpse of him. He was in the dark, and I couldn't see his face clearly. But I knew that what they threw into the house wasn't something random. I felt something was wrong. The room grew heavy. From what the driver said, the fire might not have been an accident. The inspector began to realize that things might be more complicated than he had thought. The testimony was shocking, but even more remarkable, he had not reported it until the following April. Why? Perhaps he thought it was a holiday prank, a Christmas fireworks display, or even a dangerous act that he did not want to be involved in. Whatever the motive for the silence, the testimony was enough to bring the Sodders back to the scene of the fire this time. Not to mourn, but to investigate. Shocking discovery in the backyard. While the family searched every nook and cranny, little Sylvia, the youngest daughter, ran around the yard like any curious child. Her little feet led her to a strange object lying in the grass, something like a metal ball, but with a helmet on one end. She picked it up with both hands, innocently, bewildered. George and his wife ran over, panicked. The father snatched the object, but it was the eldest son, John, who was home on leave at the time, who recognized it immediately. It's an incendiary grenade, a military-grade weapon. Silence fell. If true, it fit perfectly with George's description, a loud bang on the roof just before the fire broke out. It also completely disproved the police's initial conclusion that the fire had started in the fuse box downstairs. An incendiary grenade is a weapon designed to start fires from within, and if thrown from the roof, it would start a fire on the floor above, where the children slept. Evidence ignored? With the shocking discovery in hand, the Sodders reported it to the police, believing they now had clear evidence of arson. But the response from the authorities was strangely cold. There's no reason to reopen the investigation. A military weapon was found at the scene of the fire and was refused to be examined. Did they not want to get involved? Or were they covering something up? Were the children still alive? That same year, a pair of women came forward to the police. They claimed to have seen the Sodder children alive, somewhere else, far from Fayetteville. It wasn't an unfounded rumor. They described each child in detail, down to eye color, height, and even moles, matching the pictures the Sodders had released. As the grenades and witnesses continued to come forward, the case that had gone from an accidental fire to a carefully orchestrated conspiracy that may have involved local authorities or larger forces. But if this was indeed a plot to kidnap and destroy evidence, the question is, who did this? And why? May 1946. As the fire became a painful memory for the Sodder family, new clues continued to emerge, as if a door had never been closed, but was only opening. A woman who worked at a roadside restaurant a few hours' drive from Fayetteville contacted the police. She claimed that on the morning after the fire, she had served breakfast to a group of people, including a woman and 4 children, and that car with Florida plates was parked outside. This shocked the Sodders, who had never heard of the car in the area before the fire. But that was not all. The children of Charleston. That same year, a hotel employee in Charleston, not far from Fayetteville, went to the police to report a strange incident. She said that around midnight, a week after the fire, 4 of the 5 Sodder children had shown up at her hotel, accompanied by a group of Italian-speaking adults who were stern and unfriendly. The story frightened the Sodders, but also gave them hope. Could their children still be alive? If so, they might have been kidnapped, taken thousands of miles away, perhaps taken to Italy in a plot to avenge the political views of George, who had publicly criticized Mussolini. Suspicions grew as details like the Florida plate car and the strange language spoken by the group emerged. Was it part of an organized kidnapping plot, involving the Italian mafia? Joy and fear. Although the Sodders were glad to think that their children were still alive, they could not help but feel a new, intense fear. Were their children permanently separated and taken to a strange place beyond their control? Especially when it became clear that political intrigue and vengeance might be behind the abduction. This joy and fear could never be reconciled. Police. No new moves. But unfortunately, when the Sodders once again hoped for help from the police, they were met with indifference. Instead of clarifying new clues, the local police still insisted on the original theory that the fire was an accident caused by an electrical fault. Why did no one do anything? A year has passed, and shocking revelations continue to emerge without any progress in the investigation. Is someone hiding something? Testimonies from the bus driver, restaurant staff, and witnesses at the hotel now form a tangle of theories. Evidence suggests that it was not all an accident. There seems to be a larger conspiracy going on, and law enforcement may be trying to cover something up. Questions continue to be asked, but answers remain elusive. Why did the children appear so far away? Was there an outside force interfering with the investigation? As the Sodders struggled to find out the truth about the fire and the missing children, another suspicion arose. Their private investigator continued to investigate, and a strange connection to Nick, George Sodder's former business associate, became one of the most important clues in discovering what really happened that night. According to George, he and Nick had a good business relationship until they had a disagreement over political views, especially regarding Mussolini. After that, they stopped communicating. However, an important detail emerged during the detective's investigation. He discovered that Nick had increased George's home insurance by $250 just before the fire without telling George. This left the detective and the Sodders wondering, how could a co-insurer change the insurance amount without George's consent? The answer is pretty obvious. If the Sodders had died in the fire, Nick would have benefited from the insurance policy. But the truth doesn't stop there. What's even more surprising is that Nick was a member of the coroner's jury, the group of people tasked with determining the cause of death in cold cases. Jurors not only consider the evidence, but also decide whether there was foul play. And what's even stranger, Nick shouldn't have been on the jury, given his personal ties to the Sodders. Furthermore, as someone who could have profited from the death of the entire family, Nick was clearly a prime suspect, yet he was involved in determining the cause of the fire. Contradictions and doubts. The private investigator uncovers these crucial details, and the Sodders are further perplexed to learn that Nick may have had a motive to make the fire look like an accident, while he himself stands to gain from the deaths of their family. This makes Nick's involvement in the incident all the more apparent. With all this evidence, the Sodders and the private investigator decide that they must continue to investigate and dig deeper into Nick. Was he part of a larger conspiracy? And was the fire really an accident or the result of a carefully calculated plan to achieve Nick's personal goals? All of these questions remain unanswered, but the Sodders cannot stop searching for the truth. Even though the road ahead is full of mysteries and contradictions, the Sodders continue to face relentless opposition from the authorities and the community as they sought to uncover the truth about the horrific fire. When they approached the local prosecutor with the hope of investigating Nick, whom they suspected of being involved in the incident, the response they received was shocking. The local prosecutor, after reviewing the evidence, refused to do his job. He politely stated, "I don't want to bring a case against the people I live and eat with." This response left the Sodders confused and bewildered. They had clear evidence of a flawed police investigation, suspected Nick of being involved in the insurance policy change, But the prosecutor refused to do his job, and this only left the family feeling betrayed. They began to wonder if the local authorities were protecting a group of people connected to Mussolini or Nick, who might have paid to protect the town's secrets. The Sodders seemed unable to find support from those they trusted to help them uncover the truth. Persistence and the relentless search. 7 years had passed since the fire, and in 1953, the Sodders had no choice but to hang a billboard on the side of the road near their home. The billboard featured pictures of the 5 missing children and the question, what was their fate? Kidnapped, murdered, or still alive? It also offered a $5,000 reward for information. Over the next few years, they received countless letters from people all over the country, claiming to have seen one of the children. Although many of the clues were vague and unclear, George and Jenny persisted in pursuing each lead, hoping to find the truth. One day, George saw a photo in the newspaper of a little girl in New York who he believed could be his daughter. Without hesitation, he traveled there and asked to meet the girl. However, the girl's parents refused to meet him, and although George suspected that they might be the ones taking advantage of the kidnapping, he respected their decision and returned. Jenny also continued to pursue similar leads. She recalled the testimony of the woman from a motel who saw the children being taken into a car with Florida plates. Although these leads were all very flimsy and difficult to prove, the Sodder family never gave up hope and continued to search for anything that could lead them to the truth. A long and difficult road. From the early years after the fire until the late 1950s, the Sodders not only faced a lack of cooperation from the authorities, but also struggled with the constant pain of loss and uncertainty about the fate of the children. Despite repeated hopes raised by new leads, they were unable to find answers about what really happened that night. As the investigation continued, the big question remained, did the children really die in the fire or were they kidnapped? And if so, who was behind it? The relentless search and the last traces. As time passed and efforts continued, the Sodder family continued to search for the truth. Nearly 21 years after the fire, in 1966, Jenny, a grieving mother, suddenly thought of contacting her brother, who lived in Florida, to see if he had anything to do with the kidnapping. Although the reasons why Jenny suspected her brother were unclear, she asked the police for records proving that all of her brother's children were his. However, nothing from this investigation could solve the mystery of the children's fate. Mysterious letters and new clues. In 1966, the Sodder family continued to receive strange letters. One letter was from a woman who said she had heard 2 men calling themselves Louis and Maurice Sodder. George, without hesitation, traveled to Texas to meet them, but the meeting did not lead to any conclusions. A year later, in 1967, they received another letter from Kentucky. It contained a photograph of a young man who bore a striking resemblance to the Sodder's son, with a note on the back that read, Louis Sodder. However, this letter had no return address and no way to contact the sender. To find out more, the family hired a private investigator to travel to Kentucky. But after arriving, the investigator also mysteriously disappeared, leaving no trace. He may have been a con man who had taken advantage of the Sodders for money, or there may have been something darker behind his disappearance. Whatever the reason, the disappearance of the detective erased the last trace of the family's search, loss, and unanswered questions. Though the Sodders continued to search for years, the question of the children's fate remained unanswered. Part of them still hoped that their children might have been kidnapped, while another part couldn't help but think that they might all have died in the fire. The lies, the cover-ups, and the conflicting evidence made it impossible for them to accept the deaths of their children. Eventually, The Sodders pushed themselves into a state of despair and self-torture. The death of a child is the ultimate pain, but perhaps the worst thing is the unknown, the uncertainty of their fate. Jenny and George lived in constant anxiety, constantly searching for the truth that might never be revealed. The billboard and the question, what became their fate? The Sodders continued to hope despite so many years of disappointment. They placed a billboard near their home with pictures of all 5 children and the question, what happened to them? It shows their resilience and hope that never wavered, even as time passed and clues faded. Their search is a testament to love and perseverance that never gave up, despite all that had happened. But it was the pain of the unknown that destroyed the Sodders' lives, not the fire or the loss, but the unanswered uncertainty. The biggest question remains, did the children really die in the fire, or were they kidnapped? And if they were kidnapped, who was behind it and why? These questions will never be answered, but the Sodders will never stop searching for answers. Thank you for sharing this story. It is truly profound and full of unsolved mysteries. I'm so excited to be with you as you explore these strange stories. Wishing you continued success with your podcast. If you need any further support in the future, please let me know. Have a great night and hope to see you soon.